Wade Langston spurred his horse forward across the stretch of land he had just bought from the bank, a barren wilderness where he hoped to start a new life. Quiet and untouched by the shadows of war. But as he crossed the last low ridge, he suddenly yanked the reins tight. His heart seemed to stop. In the vast emptiness ahead, 7 bodies hung suspended from tall wooden posts. Under the pale sunlight, the ropes were drawn taut, swaying gently in the wind as if mocking life itself. Wade leapt from his saddle and sprinted forward. As he got closer, he realized what made his blood run cold. They were still alive. A trembling hand reached up toward the sky. Pale lips parted slightly, pleading for help. Wide eyes flickered with the last glimmer of hope. "Oh God!" Wade rasped, pulling out his knife. He climbed onto the rickety wooden frame and slashed at the ropes frantically. The first body dropped to the ground with a weak, rattling breath. The second one was still breathing. The third had a pulse, all 7 of them still alive. As he cut the final rope, an Apache woman opened her eyes and looked up at him, her cracked lips trembling into a whisper. "They have not won yet." Wade knelt beside the nearest woman, his hand trembling as he pressed his ear close to her mouth. Her breath was faint, like a flame flickering in the wind, but it was still there. He quickly loosened the rope around each of their necks, checked their pulses, then lifted their limp bodies one by one onto his wagon. There was no time to think, no time to be afraid. Only one truth remained. If he hesitated, those 7 lives would vanish forever. The journey back to the ranch felt longer than any day before. Cold wind bit at his face. Red dust coated his clothes, and the faint moans from the back of the wagon squeezed his heart with every mile. By the time he arrived, Wade was no longer just a rancher checking on his land. He had become the bearer of 7 souls caught between life and death. He lit a fire, boiled water, and tore cloth into makeshift bandages. His hands, once familiar with holding a rifle, now fumbled as they touched the bruises on their necks, wiping the dried blood from their bound wrists. Some remained unconscious, others twitched slightly as the warmth began to return to their bodies. "Hang on. You are going to live," Wade murmured, unsure if he was speaking to them or to himself. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, their breathing began to steady. A young woman with long black hair opened her eyes first. Those eyes, deep, sorrowful, and filled with pain, rested on Wade's face. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice like wind through a canyon. "I am the new owner of that land," Wade replied. "What happened to you?" She did not answer right away. Instead, she tried to sit up, her gaze falling to the scratches on her wrist. Tears spilled silently as she spoke. They wanted to teach the world a lesson that Apache women are not allowed to stand up against them. Wade was stunned. He did not need to hear more to understand. The bruises, the ropes, the shame in their eyes all told the story more clearly than any words could. "Who are they?" he asked, his voice growing lower. "The bank, the railroad company, and the proud men in tall hats who think our lives are worth nothing." The room fell into silence. Only the crackling fire and faint breathing could be heard. But inside Wade, another fire had begun to burn, not of pity, but of fury. He did not know exactly what he was stepping into. But one thing he knew for sure, they had survived for a reason, and that reason was now his responsibility. On the second night after their rescue, the fire crackled inside the small wooden cabin. 7 Apache women sat huddled around the stove, hand-woven blankets worn and frayed at the edges draped over their shoulders. Outside, icy winds swept across the empty land. Inside, the silence was heavy. They had remained quiet for days. But now, the truth needed to be spoken. Naira, the eldest, with eyes as dark and deep as the desert night, was the one to speak for them all. Her voice was hoarse, but every word dropped like a stone. "We are not criminals. We are daughters of this land." The story began generations ago. Their ancestors had lived on this land long before borders ever existed. In the year 1851, the tribe signed a treaty with the government, recognizing the land of Red Mesa as their traditional and non-transferable territory. They built homes, planted crops, raised livestock, and lived in peace until the white settlers began arriving in search of silver and railroad routes. They came with papers and smiles, Naira said, her eyes fixed on the flames. But when we refused to sell, the smiles vanished. Frontier Bank and the railroad company began their campaign. They declared the treaty no longer valid, hired gunmen to raid their cattle pens, poisoned their water supply, and burned dozens of huts to force the tribe off the land. When the Apache people protested, the local authorities already bought and paid for accused them of occupying public land and obstructing progress. We organized resistance, Nida continued. No weapons, no violence. We built fences around our ancestral land, raised the tribal flag, and sent letters requesting meetings with officials, but they never responded. Instead, they sent soldiers. One night, before the moon had even risen, soldiers and hired guns surrounded the village. They seized every adult woman, exactly 7 of them, dragging them from their homes in the dark. There was no trial, no official charge. Only whips, laughter, and the sentence. Rebels will hang. They wanted to kill our faith, not just our lives, Naira whispered, her voice trembling. They believed that if this generation died, the next would never dare reclaim the land. Wade sat still, his hands clenched into fists. He had seen evil in war, but never had he seen it wear the mask of law so convincingly. There was no doubt anymore. This was not just a land grab. This was a cultural purge. And then Naira looked deep into his eyes. You cut the ropes and we are still alive, which means the fight is not over. Wade nodded. In the flickering firelight, his eyes gleamed like tempered steel. No, it has only just begun. From that night on, Wade's small cabin was no longer just a temporary shelter. It became a base, a fortress, a command post for a war of justice that none of them had ever imagined would return. Wade began investigating the way a man trained by the military would quietly, patiently, and methodically. He rode into the nearest town, listened to stories in saloons, asked questions at the sheriff's office and the printing press, and the deeper he dug, the more everything reeked of deception. At the heart of it all was Frontier Bank, the very bank that had sold the land to investors from Chicago, New York, and San Francisco. But there was something strange. These contracts had been signed over 20 years ago, even before the government declared the area as unclaimed. And most of the signatures supposedly representing the Apache people were forged. They forged history, Wade muttered as he scanned the stack of documents Tala had brought back after sneaking into the bank's lawyer's office. They didn't just steal the land. They built a whole story to justify the theft. But the most chilling evidence came in a thin envelope secretly delivered to Wade by Clarabelle, the youngest daughter of a nearby settler family. Inside was an internal memo between Frontier Bank and the railroad company. When the trade route crosses Red Mesa, land value will increase 20-fold. Indigenous relocation must be completed before Q4 of this year. No court needed. Sheriff has been fully compensated. Wade laid the letter on the table. The room fell silent. The eyes of the Apache women bore into the page as if they could set it ablaze with their fury. They want to wipe out the entire tribe, Naira said, her voice barely above a whisper. Not for land, but to erase our very existence. Then we will show the world that they cannot. Wade replied, his eyes burning bright. But to do that, we need the one thing they fear the most. The truth. They began gathering everything they could, a copy of the 1,851 treaty Tala had kept, testimonies from settlers who witnessed the arrests, and a list of illegal land transactions carried out by Frontier Bank. Alun and Roya visited every farmstead, convincing villagers to sign a petition of protest. Sanaa and Takina searched for surviving Apache elders to provide their testimony. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together, and the picture was clear. This was not just land theft. It was a crime orchestrated by corrupt officials. Marshal Davidson in Tucson, Wade said, pulling out a letter the marshal had once sent him during the war. He is the only man I trust. If we get him the evidence, the federal government will have to step in. Naira looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. In her eyes was no longer the suspicion of someone betrayed, but the unshakable trust of a warrior. "We will not run anymore," she said. "We will stand, and this time we will not fall. I am truly grateful for your presence here." If this story reminded you of the old days, those dusty evenings, the sound of hooves echoing in your chest, consider subscribing to my channel so that each day we can sit together once more and I will share with you another story from the Wild West. Since the night they decided not to run anymore, the atmosphere at the ranch had completely changed. It was no longer a shelter for 7 survivors. It had become the headquarters of a quiet rebellion. Wade drew a detailed map of Red Mesa across the old wooden table marking every key location: the office of Frontier Bank, the County Land Records Archive, the post office where transaction documents passed through, and the grand house of Harrison the bank manager, the man pulling all the strings from the shadows. "We cannot just hold the evidence. We have to bring it into the light," Wade said, his eyes sharp as blades. "If we send everything to the federal authorities, they will try to intercept it before it gets there. But if we make the truth public, if the whole town sees it, then no one can silence everyone." Naira nodded. "We will make them fear the light more than they fear a bullet." The plan was divided into 3 parts. Tina and Roya would infiltrate the county records warehouse, the place that held the original land titles, to retrieve the authentic documents the bank had been forging. Tala and Sanaa would approach the local printing press where the weekly paper Arizona Chronicle was published and try to persuade the editor to print the truth. Meanwhile, Wade and Naira would break into the Frontier Bank office to retrieve the one thing everyone needed most: the black ledger evidence of bribes and illegal deals. That night, the sky was moonless. Cold winds swept across the Badlands. As if warning of a storm to come, Takana and Roya moved like shadows through the darkness, slipping past the fence around the records building and picking the lock with a slender wire. Inside, hundreds of papers lay in stacks, and among them were Landale documents bearing forged signatures from Apache elders who had been dead for decades. At the same time, Tala and Sanaa stepped through the back door of the press office. Old Editor Male, a man who once owed his life to the tribe, looked over the documents and sighed. "This town's going to blow up over this, but yes, it is time." Wade and Naira faced the most dangerous task. The Frontier office was guarded by hired guns. Wade disabled them with military precision while Naira tore through Harrison's desk. In a hidden drawer, they found what they had all hoped for: a leather-bound notebook filled with dates, names of those bribed, and amounts paid. "With this, they cannot escape," Wade said, his voice low. Before leaving, he placed a small piece of paper on Harrison's desk. It carried only 4 words: "We are still alive." By sunrise, the entire group had returned to the ranch. The evidence lay spread across the table, each page a blade in the heart of the conspiracy. They knew the fight was far from over. But for the first time, the balance of power had shifted toward justice. "They hung us to silence us," Naira said, her eyes fixed firmly on the rising Sunday. "But now it is they who will hang by the truth." News of the stolen documents and the plan to make the evidence public spread faster than they had expected. By noon the next day, Harrison received word from an informant at the printing press. His eyes darkened. "They want to drag everything into the light," he growled. "Fine, then they will not live long enough to do it." That night, under a thin crescent moon hanging over the Arizona desert, the air at Wade's ranch grew thick with tension. The wind fell still. The horses refused to settle, and all 7 Apache women could feel it. Something was coming. "They will probably come tonight," Wade said, checking the barrel of his old but reliable Winchester rifle. "And we are not running." They took positions around the ranch. T and Santa climbed onto the roof of the livestock shed with bows and pistols. Roya and Alun hid behind the hay wagon. Tala and Naira built a wooden barricade as the first line of defense. Wade, a man who had fought on the front lines, stood at the main gate because he knew that was where the enemy would strike first. And then they came more than a dozen hired guns, led by Harrison and a stranger in a black coat: Jonathan Kessler, the man who had funded the takeover of Red Mesa. "Langston," Harrison shouted, his voice slicing through the night like a blade. "Hand over those red savages and the documents. And you might live." Wade let out a cold laugh, his voice like steel. "We are not handing anyone over, and we are not afraid to die anymore." The first gunshots cracked like thunder. The ranch erupted into a battlefield. Tina dropped 2 men from the rooftop with her first shots. Sanaa burst from the shadows, firing a round that struck a man trying to set the barn ablaze. Alun hurled a lantern, igniting a wall of fire that blocked the entrance. Each of them fought not just to survive, but to reclaim their right to exist. Harrison took a bullet to the thigh and screamed for an all-out assault. But Wade, with the instincts of a man who had once fought where bullets fell thicker than rain, led the counterattack. He shot with precision, reloaded with lightning speed, and for a brief moment, the war returned to him, not to conquer this time, but to protect. The battle raged through the night. When dawn finally broke, smoke still lingered in the air, and the ground around the ranch was soaked with blood. 3 men had been captured alive. The rest fled in chaos. Harrison lay sprawled in the dirt, while Kessler was pinned to the ground by Naira, tied with the same kind of rope they had once been hung with. "How does it feel to be on the other end of the noose?" she asked, her voice cold as the desert stone. Wade stepped forward, looking down at the man behind it all, his gaze steady and calm. "Justice does not kill in the dark. It brings them into the light." 3 days after the bloody battle, the fields of Red Mesa lay under an eerie stillness. No more hoof-beats sneaking through the night. No more distant torches casting threats across the dark. Only the soft whisper of wind against the wooden fence and the lingering scent of gunpowder in the air. Remnants of a night that had forever changed the history of this land. Wade sent an urgent letter to Marshal Davidson, the federal lawman he had once served alongside in the military. In it, he detailed the entire truth, enclosing a copy of the 1851 treaty, the bribery ledger, and a list of victims swindled by Frontier Bank. The 3 captured gunmen were also turned over as witnesses. When Davidson received the letter, his reply was brief. "Keep them safe. I am coming." 2 weeks later, a convoy of armored wagons rolled into Red Mesa, led by the United States Federal Marshals. The government flag fluttered in the desert wind, and for the first time in many years, the Apache people felt that justice was no longer just a distant idea. Davidson dismounted and gripped WDE's hand firmly. "You did what the entire system tried to avoid," he said. "Now, let us finish the rest." Harrison and Kessler were handcuffed in front of the entire town, their faces pale as they listened to the charges read aloud: federal land fraud, forgery, bribery of officials, and conspiracy to commit mass murder. One by one, the victims, not just the 7 Apache women, but also settlers who had been cheated out of their land, stepped forward to testify. The trial in Tucson lasted for months and became the center of attention across Arizona. The press called it the Trial of the 7 Ropes, a landmark case that exposed the deep web of corruption connecting banks, local authorities, and railroad tycoons. In the end, Harrison and Kessler were sentenced to life in prison, and dozens of lower-level officials were dismissed or prosecuted. But the most important ruling of all, the Treaty of 1851, was reinstated. Red Mesa was officially recognized as Apache tribal land, and all fraudulent claims were voided. The names of those wrongfully hanged were carved into a memorial at the courthouse, ensuring history would never forget what happened here. The day the verdict reached Red Mesa, Wade stood by the old wooden fence, gazing across the vast land that stretched to the horizon. The wind rustled through the fresh green shoots rising from soil once soaked in blood. And he knew this was no longer disputed territory. It was home. It was memory. It was a symbol of justice reclaimed. Naira stepped beside him, resting a hand gently on his shoulder. "We survived. And this time we were heard." Wade offered a quiet smile. "No, Naira, you did not just survive. You won." Spring arrived earlier than usual the following year. The first rain softened the earth, and from soil once soaked in blood and tears, tender blades of grass rose in a vivid green. Red Mesa was no longer a land of dispute. It had become a true home, home to a tribe once sentenced to vanish, and to a man who had once believed his life had ended long ago. Wade rebuilt the fences around the ranch, not to mark boundaries, but to protect what they had reclaimed together. The Apache village rose again along the hillside. Small wooden houses stood where ashes had once smoldered, and kitchen smoke drifted into the open sky once more. Children laughed by the creek. Women wove blankets beneath the oak tree. The very tree where seven had once hung now transformed into a symbol of survival. That was how a new life began. Wade and those seven women were no longer the rescuer and the rescued. They were family. They worked together, ate together, and each evening when the horizon turned crimson with sunset, they would gather around the fire to tell the children the story of the seven ropes, a story no one was allowed to forget. One afternoon, as the golden light stretched across the grass, Naira found Wade by the horse stables. She was no longer the woman with fire in her eyes. Her gaze had softened, grown deeper, as if the desert itself had begun to bloom. "Do you ever think this was all written by fate?" she asked. Wade paused, looking at her for a long moment before smiling. "I used to think fate was something we could not change. Now I know it is something we rewrite together." A few months later, their union was celebrated beneath the old oak tree. There was no gold, no grandeur, only Apache songs, blessings from the tribe, and eyes filled with hope. Wade and Naira, two souls once deeply wounded, now stood side by side, beginning a new chapter of life. Another year passed and laughter echoed through the wooden house they had built. Their child with his mother's dark hair and his father's steady eyes was living proof that from pain and injustice, love and life could still take root. And every evening, as the sun dipped behind the distant ridges, Wade would carry his son to the fence, point toward the horizon, and say, "That is where we fought, my son. Not for revenge, but so you could live free on this land with pride and without a single rope to bind you." My friends, Red Mesa was once a land stained with crimes. Today, it is a land of love, of freedom, and of legacy. A lonely rancher and seven Apache women who were once condemned to die have rewritten fate not just for themselves, but for generations yet to come. It has been an honor to share this journey with you, the cherished audience of Wild West storytelling. I truly hope life brings you happiness and peace. I love you all. Let me know what this story meant to you. Leave a comment down below. Type the number 1 if you enjoyed this tale. And do not forget to subscribe to the channel to catch the next thrilling story from the wild.